bolting his party and leading the most important, most successful third-party campaign, as Roosevelt famously called it, the bull moose campaign. To prove he was as strong as a bull moose, TR gave a speech near the campaign's climax, just after being shot by a would-be assassin.
Good morning and welcome to the Miller Center Forum. I'm George Gillum, chair of the forum. Our guest today is Sidney Milkis. Sid Milkis, my colleague and good friend, received his undergraduate education at Muhlenberg College and his graduate education at the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Milkis spent most of his academic career at Brandeis University before joining the faculty here at the University of Virginia's Department of Politics and the Miller Center of Public Affairs in 1999. Sid served as chair of the politics department from 2004 to 2007, and presently is the White Burkett Miller Professor in the Department of Politics, and he's assistant director for academic programs here at the Miller Center. Professor Milkis' scholarship has centered on the progressive tradition in America, and he's published 6 books on the American party system, on political parties, on the New Deal, on the development of the American presidency, and most recently on the election of 1912 and its legacies. His book, Theodore Roosevelt, The Progressive Party and the Transformation of American Democracy, has been widely praised both by historians and political scientists. Please welcome Sid Milkis.
Thank you, George. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm always amazed when anybody shows up to hear me talk. My children are even more amazed. It took me 10 years to write this book. John Milton Cooper was here last Friday talking about his biography of Woodrow Wilson. He said it took him 8 years to write that book, and I'm sitting there thinking, this guy's fast. And this seems like a great celebration after a decade's work to be here with great friends of the Miller Center and some of my great friends and some of my students. Jeff Greenfield, the senior correspondent for CBS, who reviewed my book in the Wall Street Journal, said in the course of that interview that he was often asked, if you could have covered any presidential campaign in history, which would it be? His answer, he said, never varied, 1912. And this was an exciting contest. It was energized by an ex-president, the most important figure of his age, bolting his party and leading the most important, most successful third-party campaign in American history, the Progressive Party, or as Roosevelt famously called it, the bull moose campaign. I learned in the course of my research that a bull moose is a male moose, and Roosevelt called it the bull moose campaign because he said he felt as strong as a moose. To prove he was as strong as a bull moose, TR gave a speech near the campaign's climax just after being shot by a would-be assassin. I will conclude with a brief discussion of that speech. There's lots of stuff here worthy of documentary. But beyond its entertainment value, the 1912 election was the rare presidential campaign that challenged voters to think seriously about their rights and the Constitution that was ratified to fulfill those rights. It was the climactic battle of the progressive era that arose at the dawn of the 20th century, when the country first tried to come to terms with the profound challenges posed by the Industrial Revolution. The 1912 election was not what is often called a major realigning election, like the Revolution of 1800, as Jefferson called it, or the Civil War realignment triggered by the 1860 election, or the 1930 election that sort of ratified the New Deal political order. But it was a critical prelude to the New Deal. And more than this, it was a contest that initiated important historical changes that not only affected parties and elections, but also initiated the transformation of American democracy. The election showcased 4 impressive candidates. It's a great cast of characters who engaged in a remarkable debate about American politics. Besides TR, the fascinating protagonist of the book, the election included William Howard Taft, the incumbent Republican president, who gives a very powerful defense of conservatism in this election. Eugene Debs, the labor leader from Terre Haute, Indiana, How many of you have been to Terre Haute? Not bad. There's a more cosmopolitan audience than I thought. He ran for the Socialist Party at the high tide of socialism, and his effectiveness had much to do with the fact that socialism was high tide at this period. And then there was Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic governor of New Jersey, who was elected president. The only president elected to the office who had a PhD in political science, although in those days they called it a PhD in history and political science. What that tells us about the study of politics and its suitability for the presidency, I'll leave that to our discussion later. All four candidates acknowledged that fundamental changes were occurring in American politics, and each candidate attempted to define the progressive era's answer to the question raised by the new industrial order that had grown up in the American constitutional system. In particular, each candidate tried to define an answer to the challenges posed by the trusts, the large corporations which emerged for the first time during this period, embodying a concentration of economic power that posed fundamental challenges to the decentralized republic of the 19th century. Now, that the 1912 election registered and inspired fundamental changes in American politics suggests the historical importance of the Progressive Party. Not only was it the driving force of this election, it set the agenda, but with the important exception of the Republican Party of the 1850s, it was the most important third party in American history. With the celebrated former President Roosevelt as its candidate, the Progressive Party won more than 27% of the popular vote and 88 electoral votes, the electoral votes of 6 important states. This was extraordinary for a third party. No third party candidacy for the presidency before or after 1912 has received such a large percentage of the popular votes or as many electoral votes as TR did. In fact, had the Democrats not responded to the excitement aroused by TR and the Progressive Party and nominated their own progressive candidate, Wilson, who only got nominated on the 46th ballot at the Democratic Convention, had that not happened, Roosevelt might have been elected to a third term in 1912 as the head of a party and movement dedicated to making America over. As it was, the Progressive Party pioneered a new form of modern politics. They deliberately saw their task as modernizing American politics, one that eventually would displace the traditional localized democracy shaped by the two-party system, which had dominated representative government in the United States since the beginning of the 19th century. Many characteristics of our politics, which are conventionally understood as new, were born or were critically advanced by the Progressive Party campaign of 1912. Having been denied the Republican nomination in spite of trouncing the incumbent, William Howard Taft, in the primaries, the first primary contest in American presidential politics, TR bolted the Republican Party. Then, as he famously put it in his confession of faith at the Progressive Party convention, he stood at Armageddon, ready to battle for the Lord. I love speaking those words. Makes me feel empowered. Drawing support, and he was very modest, TR. Drawing support and inspiration from the social gospel movement, whose members saw their task as promoting Christian social action. Roosevelt and his fellow bull mooser defined the Lord's cause as a new idea and practice of democracy. TR's crusade made universal use of the direct primary a cause célèbre. Because of the agitation he stirred, 12 states did select the delegates to the National Convention by direct primaries, but still the presidential selection process was dominated by state and local party officials. In the face of that, the Progressive Party called for universal use of the direct primary. The Progressive Party also assaulted traditional partisan loyalties. It championed candidate-centered campaigns, or as the cover as my book suggests, they called for a direct relationship between candidates and the people. And it took advantage of the centrality of a newly emergent mass media. We didn't have TV yet, but we had the beginnings of a mass media in the form of independent newspapers, popular magazines, movies, Movie houses were very important in the election and became the staple of political advertising until television became important in politics. Now, the movies were silent, but there were audio recordings of the candidates, which allowed people to hear the most important excerpts from their speeches. And finally, the Progressive Party convened an energetic but uneasy coalition of self-styled public advocacy groups. The 1912 Progressive Party is the first time in American politics when African Americans and women play an important role in a presidential campaign. All of these features I've just described, which are pioneered by the Progressive Party of 1912, make the election of 1912 look more like that of 2008 than that of 1908. Now, this is not to argue that so-called modern politics was created out of whole cloth for 1912, or in 1912. For example, the candidate-centered campaign, where the candidate stands apart and defines the election more than the party does, that really had its beginnings in the 1896 election, when William Jennings Bryan, the great commoner, was the first presidential candidate to tour the country and appeal directly for the people's votes, and established an important tradition in American politics, the whistle-stop tour. But the Progressive Party campaign of 1912 was the first to attack political parties and the critical role these organizations played in American elections and government. And it championed instead a reconstituted modern presidency as the leading instrument of American democracy, the steward of the public welfare, to use TR's beguiling phrase. As a party that embraced and went far in legitimizing new social movements and candidate-centered campaigns, the Progressive Party animated a plebiscitary form of popular rule that evolved over the course of the 20th century and appears, for better or worse, to be coming into its own in recent elections. Both John McCain and Barack Obama channeled TR in 2008. In fact, neither McCain or Obama would have won their nomination was it not for the primaries, where rank-and-file voters choose the candidate, rather than elected officials and party veterans, who dominated the political process prior to 1912. But Roosevelt's campaign as the Progressive Party's candidate went beyond reforming the political process. It was rooted in a belief that the constitutional structure of American government, with limited federal power, and a judiciary striking down economic regulations as violations of natural rights, that system simply could not cope with the realities of 20th century industrial, with the realities of the 20th century industrial order. Only federal power in the form of regulatory bodies and laws, authorized, as TR put it, by the whole people, could match the power of corporations and trusts. Our aim, he argued during the course of the campaign, should be to make the United States, as far as possible, not merely a political, but an industrial democracy. It is our task, he continued, to replace the obsession with private property and private rights with a consideration and a respect for human rights. Now, although the high ideals of Roosevelt's Progressive Party campaign were never achieved, it marked a critical juncture, as we political scientists say, between the limited constitutional government rooted in a natural rights understanding of the Constitution that had dominated American politics since the beginning of the 19th century, and an executive-centered administrative state that presumed to give authoritative expression to public opinion. Now, the power of this election stems largely from the fact that it was not just TR, as important as he was, but also an important party, insurgent party, the Progressive Party, which was the vanguard of a strong popular movement. Now, the Progressive Party itself would have a brief life. When TR refused to run again in 1916, he doomed the third party to the dustbin of history. But the platform of the Progressive Party and the causes that platform championed would endure. It was not, as many historians and political scientists assert, merely an extension of TR's enormous ambition, although his ambition was enormous. Rather, the platform represented the culmination of a concerted, programmatic effort that began 3 years before. One that included many reformers who were at the vanguard of progressive reform. For example, the creation of the platform included the celebrated social worker, John Adams, excuse me, what a Freudian slip. Jane Addams, excuse me. Oh my God, my wife will never forgive me for saying that. the highly regarded journalist, William Allen White, and the famous progressive intellectual Herbert Crowley, arguably the prophet of progressive democracy, the founder of the New Republic. All these people played a critical part in the platform's creation. Among its planks were proposals for national regulations and social welfare that would not be enacted until the New Deal. In fact, there are striking parallels between the Progressive Party platform of 1912 and the Democratic Party platform of 1936. In fact, with respect to measures, most notably national health insurance, the Progressive Party prescribed core progressive commitments that remain unfulfilled in American politics. Now, Obama often invokes TR as being the first important figure in American politics to champion national health care, to champion a national health care plan. That is true, but TR didn't do that during his presidency. His presidency was pretty tepid in comparison to his campaign in 1912. It was his campaign in 1912 when he headed an insurgent movement that he made this proclamation that it was necessary to have a national health insurance system in the United States. Now, in addition to these social welfare measures, the Progressive Party also advocated important political reforms. Not just measures to strengthen representative government, such as the right of women to vote and the direct election of senators, as fundamental as those were, but also reforms dedicated to what TR called pure democracy. That is, democracy purged of the impure influence of special interests. In addition to the universal use of the direct primary that was proclaimed to be an attack on the party convention system that denied TR the Republican nomination, these measures included the initiative, referenda on laws that the state courts declared unconstitutional, referenda, that is, on court decisions, and an easier method to amend the constitutions. These are measures that continue to guide reformers, liberals and conservatives alike, who carry on the progressive crusade to remove or lessen the constitutional distance that separates representatives and public opinion. Now, I would argue, and the evidence I think bears me out, that the Progressive Party's political, or I think we can call it a constitutional program, was especially important. Above all, these proposals unified the progressive movement and ensured its lasting legacy. The Progressive Party's declaration of pure democracy was exalted as a covenant with the people, a deep and abiding pledge to make the people masters of their Constitution. The Progressive Party dedicated itself to a welfare state, but at the same time, it stood for the proposition that any program of social welfare could not be adopted until it was sanctified by public opinion. There was no prospect in the United States where centralized administration was a cardinal vice that the people would grant legitimacy to a welfare state that was not attuned to the preferences or even biases of public opinion. In fact, the Progressive Party campaign was seriously threatened by fundamental disagreements among its supporters over issues that betrayed an acute sensitivity, if not attachment, to the deep-rooted fear of centralized power in American democracy. For example, the party was bitterly divided over civil rights, which led to struggles at the Progressive Party convention over delegate selection rules and the platform. Struggles that turned on whether the party should confront the shame of Jim Crow. In the end, it did not, and accepted the right of states and localities to resolve the matter of race relations. Ironically, W.E.B. Du Bois, who saw his civil rights plank spurned by the Progressive Party convention, supported Wilson in the 1912 election, and that was a decision that he would soon come to regret. The Progressive Party also waged a fractious struggle at the party convention over the appropriate method to tame the trusts. How do you regulate business? A contest to determine whether an interstate trade commission with a whole lot of administrative discretion to regulate business practices or energetic antitrust policy was the appropriate method to reform the political economy. Militant New Nationalists, as they called themselves, led by Roosevelt, prevailed, pledging the party to regulate rather than to dismantle corporate power. But this disagreement carried over to the general election. The Democratic Party, under the guidance of their candidate for president, Wilson, and his advisor, Louis Brandeis. Ever since I had my career at Brandeis, as George mentions, I have to get him into my speech, into my lectures at least once. And Brandeis was an important advisor to Wilson in coming up with a new freedom version of progressivism. And in contrast to New Nationalism, New Freedom progressivism prescribed antitrust measures and state regulations as an alternative to the expansion of national administrative power. Wilson would constantly ask at his campaign rallies, what would Jefferson do if he was here with us? And Wilson's answer was he would destroy the process of monopoly, and he would unleash the entrepreneurial talents of, as Wilson put it, men who are on the make. New Nationalists styled themselves neo-Hamiltonians. New Freedom progressives styled themselves neo-Jeffersonians. And as neo-Jeffersonians, they were very skeptical about expanding national administrative power. A sign of that is that the Democratic Party platform of 1912 called for a constitutional amendment that would establish a one-term limit for presidents. No sooner had Wilson been elected than he forgot about that. But that's for the Q&A. In the final analysis, then, the Progressive Party's militant reformist platform disguised fundamental disagreements among leading progressive reformers over the critical role of the national state, over the critical role of national administrative power in American politics, in regulating the economy and society. Now, foreign policy was hardly mentioned in the 1912 election, but no sooner had Wilson been elected than this too would be a fractious issue for progressive reformers. Nevertheless, in spite of all these disagreements, there was one doctrine that united the disparate strands of progressivism: its advocacy of the rule of the people. And sensing that pure democracy was the glue that held together the movement he sought to lead, Roosevelt made the right of the people to rule the centerpiece of his insurgent presidential campaign. The program itself was highly controversial, especially the plank calling for popular referenda on court decisions. But TR's campaign was even more controversial than the progressive platform. It championed an unvarnished majoritarianism. Toward the end of September, Roosevelt announced in a speech in Phoenix, Arizona, maybe he got too much sun out there, that he would go even further than the Progressive Party platform. In promoting the recall of public officials, he would apply the recall to everybody, including the president. Even chairs of the Miller Center Forum would have to be subject to the recall. In response to this, the great commenter, William Jennings Bryan, even the great commenter, William Jennings Bryan, who supported Woodrow Wilson's New Freedom campaign, blushed. Populist methods such as the recall, Bryan insisted, should not be nationalized. They should be confined to the states. Now, TR's defense of pure democracy infused his campaign with deep constitutional significance. In its ambition to establish a direct relationship between public officials and mass public opinion, the progressive program seemed to challenge the very foundation of Republican democracy, as James Madison had termed it. The idea underlying the United States Constitution that space created by institutional devices such as the separation of powers and federalism allowed representatives to govern competently and fairly. Now, Jefferson and Jackson had celebrated public opinion, but they supported political parties that were important mediating institutions. TR's progressivism threatened to sweep all intermediary institutions off the stage. And the controversy of this constitutional program allowed it to dominate the campaign. All other candidates had to react to Teddy Roosevelt. The most important reactor to Roosevelt was William Howard Taft. And William Howard Taft is a very important figure in my book because I think there's a real sense in which he represents the last hurrah of constitutional sobriety in American politics. And in fact, there's a real sense in which the most important exchange in this dramatic election was that between Taft and Roosevelt. Now, Taft did not take easily to this contest with TR, which flared up in the primary contests that preceded the Republican convention. First of all, he was humiliated by the fact that he would be the, I'm sorry, I drank too much caffeine this morning. Forgive my Fidel Castro style of speaking. I have to adjust to the Raiola regime, I think. He was the first president who had to campaign for his party's nomination. He was also deeply hurt by TR's challenge to him. After all, Roosevelt had passed the progressive scepter to him in 1908. He was the heir apparent to Teddy Roosevelt. And as a member of TR's administration, Taft had supported the pragmatic progressive program that TR had pursued in office between 1901 and 1909, when Roosevelt worked for specific policies such as the Hepburn Railroad Regulation Act, with the cooperation of the Republican Party regulars. And yet Taft now found his own efforts to carry on that pragmatic tradition of reform, the object of scorn, the victim of TR's celebration of pure democracy. Opposed to TR's attacks on the party convention, his attacks on the courts, and the constitutional amendment process, Taft was publicly condemned as a conservative, which was a pejorative label at this time, signifying he was the enemy of the people. But Taft eventually embraced the charge of conservatism leveled against him. In the battle for the GOP nomination, he resisted the Progressive Party's attempt, as he put it, to tear down all the checks and balances of a well-adjusted, democratic, constitutional, representative government. Taft's defense of the Constitution included support for the two-party system. He considered electoral competition between two great parties an indispensable part, as he put it, of a well-adjusted form of American democracy, the sheet anchor of popular government. At the same time, he insisted that the Progressive Party's attack on representative government called for a new understanding of Republican conservatism, rooted less in the defense of property rights and business, the kind of conservatism celebrated by William McKinley and Mark Hanna, and the kind of defense of property that was dear to most Republican conservatives who called themselves stand-patters. Less attuned to that, Taft said, the Republican Party must be, than to a Whiggish, Burkean-like defense of ordered liberty. The real usefulness of the Republican Party, he insisted, consisted in its conservative tendencies to preserve constitutional government, and particularly to protect the independence of the courts. The most sacred duty of true conservatives, Taft urged, was to uphold the courts. It was unthinkable, he told an audience in Boston, Massachusetts, that Roosevelt should seriously propose to have a plebiscite on questions involving the construction of the Constitution. Now, despite Taft's indictment of the progressives' threat to trash the Constitution, despite the hope of TR's political enemies that such a bold campaign would kill him politically, it was not Roosevelt but Taft who suffered humiliating defeat. TR thrashed him in the primary contest, even beating Taft in his home state of Ohio. And in the general election, Taft won only 2 states, Utah and Vermont, and won 23% of the popular vote. As goes Utah, so goes Vermont, became the rallying cry of constitutional conservatism. In contrast, TR's strong showing and his dominant presence in the campaign signaled the beginnings of an important change in American democracy, the birth of modern democracy, which became part of the living Constitution during the 1930s. Taft, as well as most Republicans and Democrats, were surprised that TR's provocative campaign for pure democracy was so well received in many parts of the country. Communicated directly to voters through the new mass media, independent newspapers, popular magazines, audio recordings of TR's most important rhetoric and movie houses, it resonated especially well in the fastest growing areas of the country, which best represented the future of America. Progressives insisted with considerable political effect that they did not seek to destroy the Constitution, but to revitalize and democratize it in the face of the hard challenges thrown up by the industrial order. Reformers in the past had celebrated the Declaration and the natural rights in the Declaration. Progressives were the first reformers to celebrate the preamble of the Constitution. Their task, progressives claimed, was to make practical the exalted, elusive idea of we the people, which would receive its highest expression in the autonomous political executive, a modern president freed from the gravitational pull of party-dominated legislatures and lawyer-dominated courts. Now, let me wrap up with a few quick observations about two other important actors. Can I have she already gave me the 5 minutes, but can I have like 2 more minutes? I promise I'll wrap it. The Progressive Party received welcome acknowledgement of its support for American democracy in a well-publicized endorsement by the famous inventor Thomas Edison. Edison was an extremely important figure at this time. A 1913 poll was taken, and he was found in that poll to be considered the most useful man in America. What I wouldn't give to be considered useful. My kids would really have respect for me if I was considered useful. Edison's allegiance was announced with great fanfare in the New York Times in an article with the appropriate headline, "Edison discovers he's a bull mooser." Edison gave, I found in my archival research, $100 to the Progressive Party convention, to the Progressive Party. He was a little cheap, but he also gave. He made the 4 recordings of TR's voice that were used in the campaign as kind of an in-kind contribution, but really it was his endorsement that was so important to the Progressive Party. In fact, the fact that celebrities like Edison were significant in this campaign is another sign that this is a modern campaign. Constitutional conservatives feared, like Taft, feared progressive democracy's faith in public opinion. But Edison viewed it as a virtue, especially as it would free the country to experiment politically. His experiments led to electric light bulbs replacing gas lights. By the same token, Edison claimed, the Progressive Party heralded the displacement of party politics by democratic innovations such as the referendum and recall. Such political experimentation, Edison insisted, celebrated rather than diminished American individualism. Now, TR's more radical critics, the socialists, agreed that progressive democracy posed no threat to the American political heritage, although they agreed with Edison grumpily. Not surprisingly, the socialist candidate Eugene Debs attacked the Progressive Party as a reactionary protest of the middle classes, built largely upon the personality of one man and not destined for permanence. The progressive fragility stemmed not just from TR's notoriety, Debs argued, but also from the flimsy doctrine that underlay it. Although supportive of political reform, Debs had long considered devices such as the referendum a very small part of the Socialist Party program. The disease that confronted America or afflicted it was not too little democracy, but capitalism, which required the heightening of class consciousness and conflict. This was the solution to which progressive forces in Europe and Great Britain had turned to social democratic parties. Yet the Progressive Party denied class was important. Adding insult to injury, the progressives chose the red bandana as the symbol of their party. They stole, Debs lamented, the red flag of socialism. Understandably, Debs was furious. Not only did TR steal the red flag of socialism, but also the socialist thunder, just when they seemed to be emerging as an important influence in the country. Debs received 6% of the vote, the best showing a socialist ever received in a presidential election. But by all accounts, Debs' showing would have been much greater, but for the preemption of the Progressive Party, by the way TR stole his thunder. Why no socialism in America? Political scientists and historians have asked that forever. And I would suggest that the Progressive Party is an important part of that complex story. America's constitutional heritage, its emphasis on individualism, inoculated the country against social democracy. But the Progressive Party campaign of 1912 gave effect to these cultural and institutional dimensions of American politics by giving birth to a reform movement that celebrated a new, more cosmopolitan form of American individualism. Now, I started by telling you that Roosevelt was shot and gave a speech anyway. Well, that speech had very much to do with his attempt to steal the thunder of the Socialist Party. He was shot in Milwaukee, preparing to give a speech in what was then the hotbed of socialism. This was a strong area of socialist support. And while he was sitting in a car waiting to go to the auditorium, he was shot by a would-be assassin who was only 7 feet away from him. He fell back, and everybody thought he would never get up again. But typical TR, he popped right up again. Took a look at himself, saw that he wasn't coughing blood, and decided he could go ahead with the speech. And he went ahead and gave a 90-minute speech at the Milwaukee auditorium. He didn't give his regular speech. That was a 50-page manuscript that he had in his pocket that deflected the bullet and may have saved his life. I've always thought about this as I go to talks with my... But he gave an impromptu address instead that was a strong argument for the need of a third way between the greed of the have-nots and the greed of the haves. The fact that he was nearly assassinated, he said, showed that America was badly polarized, that it was being divided by rancorous politics. And only the Progressive Party, in the name of the whole people, could pave a third way between laissez-faire and socialism. The drama of that event, I think, suggests why Wilson, when he became president, governed as a new nationalist rather than a new freedom progressive. And the drama of that event, I think, shows why the Progressive Party program of social and political reform became an enduring feature of American politics and electoral contest. Thank you so much for your patience.
Those who would like to engage in the dialogue with Professor Milkis, please come on to the back of the room where I will be, and we have time for a number of questions, and I know Sid will answer them all with gusto and enthusiasm.
With Castro-like, Fidel-like.
Sid, your argument, which I think is persuasive in the book, is that despite the drubbing, really, that the Bull Moose Party took in 1912, progressivism would continue to be an important, really fulcrum in government as it evolved. You said, and I think you were quoting Herbert Crowley at this, that the people wanted to be protected against the government rather than to use the government as an instrument for the attainment of positive public ends, and that really accounts for the election of 1912. But isn't really the legacy that same tension continues to be what animates American elections?
Yeah. Wow, that's a tough first question. I was hoping to get a couple of softballs before I... I think that tension is still there. And in fact, the progressives kind of take us into a conundrum. They celebrate and they unleash forces that really begin to establish a strong executive-centered administrative state on the one hand, and mass democracy, the rule of the people, on the other. But if you go back and read great political theorists like Tom Jefferson, you see that there's tension between centralized power and self-government. The progressives said their task, and this was necessary given the 20th century, to reconcile that tension, that somehow the presidency had to be established as the representative of the national government, which had to be empowered to take account not only of problems in the country, but also growing problems in the world that would pull America into the context of world affairs. I think if you look at the history of the 20th century, that reconciliation, that attempt at a reconciliation, was not a failure. That throughout the 20th and 21st century, charismatic leaders and structural problems have connected in a way that has brought about important change in American politics. This is true of Franklin Roosevelt. This is true of Lyndon Johnson. This is true of Ronald Reagan. And now I think it's true of Barack Obama. And I say in the last chapter of my book that Barack Obama kind of represents the apotheosis of progressive democracy. One of my candid friends told me using that term apotheosis was going to probably cut back on sales considerably. But there's a real sense in which he represents a culmination. There's a real tendency in progressive democracy to put so much emphasis on the presidential candidate and presidents as to celebrate a kind of cult of personality. And I think that cult of personality, in a way, sheds light on the promise of Barack Obama's leadership. And he's, in a sense, employing public opinion to be a strong reform leader. On the other hand, one has to ask whether a country can call itself a democracy, can proclaim it has self-government, if it invests so much political capital in one individual. Can one individual really represent democracy on a grand scale? That question was at the center of the 1912 election, and I think it's still important as we watch this very talented and very beleaguered leader of the 21st century. Is that at all responsive? Yeah. Now I'm in trouble. How come all the academic gets to...
I said,
Hi, Jeff.
you know me as Jeff Jenkins in your department. There's always a danger in placing, in my mind, too much emphasis on one election or one instance or one something in any kind of political phenomena, right? I think it's fair to say that the progressive movement, especially the political movement, was at least partially derivative of the populist movement before, right? It did not spring from whole cloth via, the TR or the early 1900s, right? The degree to which party leaders held control of the system lingered until the 1970s, right? The presidential nominating system. So there was nothing special in that regard about 1912, and it took another 3 generations, right, for primaries and caucuses to really make the decision on presidential nominations. And I think it's fair to say that both parties, both the Democrats and the Republicans, really retrenched in the 1920s. They became very conservative parties. And it required a crisis. It required the Great Depression for FDR to emerge. You would not have had FDR emerge and partially follow up on some of the things that TR was managing in 1912 without some major event, major exogenous shock. So on some dimensions, 1912 seems like kind of an interesting deviation from normal politics, right? With a charismatic figure, an ex-president running against a sitting president, right? And I think, it's certainly fair to say that the progressive movement had real effects on various things in American democracy, but I wonder if we're placing too much emphasis on TR and the progressive movement.
That's a great question, and there's a kind of a line there. So we should have like a couple of beers and lunch and talk about all that. So real quickly on three of your 3 major points. Populists, there is some similarity, and I think I mentioned the great commenter. The important difference is the populists basically were building on the Jeffersonian, Jacksonian tradition. They wanted to destroy monopoly, not regulate big business. They feared centralized power. What the progressives do that's wholly new is try to connect the American idea of self-government to national administrative power, to take the presidency that before was considered a danger to democracy and make it the steward of the people. And as I mentioned, the Democratic Party called for a one-term presidency in 1912, and they were echoing the populists who in 1890 in their campaign called for a one-term presidency. The 1920s is an important retrenchment in some ways, but one thing that fascinates me about it, Jeff, is how public opinion remains so important. And for all their conservatism, those presidents during this period, particularly Calvin Coolidge, interestingly enough, Silent Cal, were very much committed to extending the progressive ideas of public relations and connecting the national government, and particularly the presidency, with public opinion. In fact, it's Calvin Coolidge, not Franklin Roosevelt, who's the first person to speak to the American people directly on the radio. One interesting factoid that might point to this importance of public opinion even through the 1920s is that Eugene Debs in World War I was put in jail for 10 years for violating the Sedition Act, which basically was an act against speaking out against the war effort. And he was pardoned. It's interesting that the progressive Wilson administration puts Taft in jail. He's pardoned by Warren Harding. And one might say, well, Warren Harding and the Republicans believed in natural rights. They didn't buy this idea of the people that led to this plebiscitary politics during World War I, which turned regressive. But if you read the brief of Coolidge's, of Harding's Attorney General, he said Debs should be released not because of natural rights. It doesn't say that. It says because he's become a popular figure, and he's so popular. Public opinion is in such support of him. That's why we need to free him. So the 1920s is not simply a retreat. And then FDR, I would simply say that so much of what FDR builds on is in the Progressive Party of 1912. And everybody thinks Roosevelt just experimented, that he was creating all this stuff out of whole cloth. Well, in fact, he was building on a movement that he was very familiar with. He always said he only had one rival in his life, Teddy Roosevelt. Alf Landon just didn't cut it, you know. It was said of Alf Landon in 1936 that if he had made one more speech, he would have lost Canada. But Teddy Roosevelt was his rival, and much of what he tries to do is build on and, in fact, trump Teddy Roosevelt. I know that's not adequate to that really important question, Jeff, but we can talk about it more later. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Sid. That was very enjoyable. But it does seem awfully ironic that by every account, TR's 2 terms were really successful. I mean, he's on Mount Rushmore, for God's sake.
Yeah, of course, he engineered that, you know, but that's,
yeah.
That's another book. I was a friend of TR's up there carving them.
And he handpicked Taft, and I know Taft disappointed him somehow. Is there anything specific? And since, wasn't the country booming? I mean, the auto industry had just gone from 0 to 100 in that period. And there was no economic downturn or anything. I mean, it was wasn't he a little early for his time? I mean, no crisis really on the horizon.
Teddy Roosevelt?
Yeah, TR.
Yeah. There's kind of 2 questions in there. One regarding Taft. Taft disappointed Roosevelt in 2 ways. One, his falling out with Gifford Pinchot, the great conservationist, and Roosevelt, as all of you have seen Ken Burns' documentary, know conservation was a very important cause for Roosevelt. And Taft, if there's one issue Taft clearly backtracked on, it was conservation, and he had a falling out with Pinchot. The other thing was Taft was viewed as a weak leader. And the idea of progressivism is you need a strong, visionary leader, or else the national government doesn't take on the responsibilities it needs to take on. And so those are the 2 sort of concrete reasons. The other thing is TR's enormous ambition. I think as soon as he decided that he would not run for a 3rd term, which he could have done and won, I think, he regretted it. He announced it, unfortunately, in a fit of honor after he was elected in 1904. He said, it's not a good idea to have a president serve for 3 terms. I'm going to step down after my 2nd term, even though it's not 2 full terms. And I think he regretted that. When he saw this progressive movement cresting and Taft looking tepid against it, he saw that as an opportunity. And so he had to sprint ahead, because for much of his career, he's pretty moderate. He had to sprint ahead to catch up to that parade that was moving on without him. Regarding the times, these were good times. I think 4% unemployment. Now, you did have terrible industrial problems. You had accidents in the workplace and so forth. And also, as Deb said, the wage slavery was not too much worse than chattel slavery in the mid-19th century at this time. But you're right to say TR was ahead of his time, and he was always disappointed that he was president during a rather prosperous and peaceful times in American history. He never forgave Woodrow Wilson for being president during World War I. They got along pretty well until World War I, but he never forgave him for being the president when this great conflict broke out instead of himself. Yes, sir.
Surely one of the most contentious and polarizing issues in our country for several decades is the question of abortion. Yes. This is a decision decided upon by a majority of 9 unelected judges. I'd like to know what you think Teddy Roosevelt would do today were he president to try to assuage and settle this issue in one way or another.
Wow, what would Teddy Roosevelt, boy, that's really hard to fathom. What would Teddy Roosevelt do about problems like abortion and same-sex marriage? I really don't know what he would do, but I would guess, I mean, if he's true to his progressive principles, he would argue that the courts should not have this power, that this should be decided in referenda in the states, if not by national referenda. It's interesting, however, that if you look at some of these abortion cases, the Supreme Court invokes public opinion, fairly or not. If you read Justice O'Connor's decisions, and she was in the catbird seat during her time on the court, she doesn't really invoke law in kind of cutting the difference on abortion. She says this is where public opinion is. And I think, I don't want to stretch this too far, but it shows that an important contribution of progressivism is not just to exalt presidential power, as important as that's been, but more fundamentally, the way it exalts public opinion, the way that becomes an obsession in American politics. That was not the case before 1912. It becomes the case after 1912, and even the Supreme Court can't seem to ignore it.
Could you comment on the history of the caucus as a way of choosing delegates for presidential convention? What would the progressives have thought about the caucus? And if it would have been a negative reaction, in light of the fact that Obama used the caucus so effectively, does this sort of create a gap or in the connection between the progressives and Obama?
Boy, these are tough questions, George. I thought I told you to queue up easy questions for me. The caucus, it really comes out of the McGovern-Fraser reforms, which really initiated in a fundamental way the final reforms of the presidential selection process and finally did away pretty much with the state and local party leaders' dominance of the presidential selection process and replaced that with what they called a progressive process. And they did prescribe primaries as one way of being true to the progressive ideal, but the other way they came up with, the other method that was acceptable was this caucus, these participatory caucuses, which are different from the party caucuses in that these are the people who show up at living rooms and gymnasiums and deliberate about not only whom the presidential candidate should be, but also what issues are important to the campaign. And I think this goes back to George's point about how this notion of centralized power was, and this kind of plebiscitary feature was kind of at odds with any genuine notion of democracy. I think the caucus was viewed as a possible progressive device that would be less plebiscitary and more deliberate than the primary. Whether it's turned out that way is a really important question that I don't have time to answer. I think what is also telling about the last campaign, however, which shows the importance of progressivism, is that the idea of superdelegates making the decision, which is kind of like a remnant of the old party conventions, that was rejected out of hand. The notion that Hillary Clinton, having fewer delegates, could somehow mobilize these superdelegates on her, that was rejected out of hand. And there you see, I think, the powerful imprint of the progressive idea of democracy.
Hi, I'm Emily Charnock. I'm in the graduate student in the politics department and a student of Professor Milkis.
God bless you.
I was interested in the interaction between the socialists and the progressives,
Yes.
and wondering if there might be any truth in a sort of skeptical position that the progressives were in some ways trying to circumvent the socialists by conceding some of their movement. And I was just wondering if you could comment on that and as to whether progressivism is something of a coherent philosophy on its own grounds.
Another easy question. I think it's reasonably coherent, and it's at least you can see what the core ideas are: social and economic justice and pure democracy. The tension between them is what always raises the question of how coherent it is. Regarding the socialists, in addition to the symbolic stealing of the red flag of socialism, progressives also stole some of the planks from the socialist platform. As much as they could steal and still not be considered socialist. That is, they didn't steal the condemnation of capitalism and the call for the nationalization of the means of production in the socialist platform. But they did steal the commitments to the social welfare measures prescribed by the Socialist Party. And those are the ones I laid out before: right to social insurance, state, and so forth. Pretty much what becomes the New Deal and the aspirations of liberalism pretty clearly by the 1930s. And this, even though this leaves what Debs considers to be really at the forefront of his commitment, that is, a condemnation of capitalism, the fact that these welfare state measures are now being championed by the progressives means, and this is why Roosevelt is viewed as such a threat, that a lot of middle-class Americans who might have supported Debs are now going to support Roosevelt and the progressive program. And that's pretty much what happened in 1912 and afterwards. And I've taken a pretty close look at the votes that Roosevelt got and the votes that Debs got. And Debs does well in those places of industrial strife, like Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, where you would expect him to do well. Roosevelt does well in rising metropolitan areas, like Chicago and Milwaukee, which suggests that what he has done is stolen the middle class basis of the Socialist Party. And that proved critical in the development of strong social democratic parties, or as in your country, the Labor Party in other countries. So Roosevelt even called a New York socialist into his council while he was writing the Confession of Faith. So this guy, Robert Bruere, this guy could tell him, about what kind of socialism he could get away with as a middle-class reformer. And that became a big brouhaha, cause célèbre, and that guy was expelled by the New York Socialist Party. So there's a very careful stealing of the thunder of the Socialist Party, which prevents it from becoming, I think, a major force in American politics. It's interesting that FDR has no enemies on the left, very few. Huey Long, but Eugene Debs was a much more I think, dangerous threat from the left, if you view the left as a threat. FDR only has to worry about the right, and I think that's another important legacy of the Progressive Party.
During the 20 years before the Bull Moose election of 1912, the hardest of hardcore racists across the South were talking about purifying the electorate, which was their shorthand for basically nullifying the 14th and 15th Amendments and getting African Americans out of the electorate. As you reported very accurately, I think, neither the Republicans nor the progressives were able to resolve conflicts within the party over what to do about the black voter. And Wilson was, to put it charitably, indifferent to the rights of blacks. Was Teddy Roosevelt's use of the phrase pure democracy an accident?
An accident in that it did not include African American, I see what you're saying.
Was this simply an echo?
No, when Teddy Roosevelt and the Progressive Party trumpet the idea of pure democracy, it's not meant to be Darwinian in a regressive way or to celebrate to exalt Jim Crow into a doctrine, into an ideal. And in fact, many members of the Progressive Party were also co-founders of the NAACP. I believe the NAACP was founded in 1909, am I right about that? I'm pretty sure. And people like Jane Addams, who were central to the Progressive Party campaign, were also very instrumental in the founding of the NAACP. That all said, the idea of celebrating civic nationalism and had an uneasy relationship with civil rights. Because Roosevelt knew, for example, that if he had a civil rights plank in the platform, he couldn't win any support in the South. And in fact, there was a lot of prejudice in the North. And so and Roosevelt wasn't the most pro-civil rights activist at the Progressive Party convention, but even people like Jane Addams acknowledged we can't take civil rights on now. We have to build a strong national movement, and if we do that at some point, this party committed to justice will have to take on civil rights. Now, just one thing. We should not be too harsh to the progressives for turning down these delegate challenges in 1912 because a strikingly similar episode occurs at the 1964 Democratic Convention when the Mississippi Free Democratic Party is turned away by Lyndon Johnson and other liberal Democrats. Hubert Humphrey is at the center of a bargain that's struck, which sort of sacrifices the Mississippi Party for a great victory in 1964. And so throughout American history, race has been, with foreign policy, I think, has been a very important fault line that has worked against the development of a strong progressive, then now called liberal movement.
The book is Theodore Roosevelt, the Progressive Party and the Transformation of American Democracy. Thanks, Sid Milkis.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.